I am one of your hosts this afternoon. And of course, with me is Anna Green, all the way from Berlin. Anna is our co-host this afternoon, of course, our resident space expert. And right now we are we're just about 50 minutes before the launch is scheduled to go off. That's 3:22 Eastern Daylight Time, current time 2:33 Eastern. Anna, how are you feeling today?
I am feeling great, and hopefully Take Two will be the launch we get to have.
Yeah, hey, so the weather is still on and off. Right now, the ascent looks pretty good, so we don't have some of the issues that we had on Wednesday. But we still do have some red indicators in the range for KSC. So we're going to be doing what we can today to get us to that 3:22 launch. We should have a T-minus 45-minute go, no-go in just a bit. Right now, it looks like we are going to go for propellant loading. So what we're going to do here is bring up our big screen, what we're going to be working with today. And so we've got a number of the live streams, SpaceX, Mission Control, and NASA, as well as a number of Twitter feeds from some of the experts, we will say, out there in reporting in space. So welcome to those of you who are joining us on Zoom. Welcome for those of you who are joining us on YouTube, and of course on Facebook Live. So we are really happy to have everybody out here today. As we did last time, I think I'll turn it over to Anna for a little bit. Kind of give us the context of why this Demo-2 flight is so important for us historically.
Sure. So is my audio sounding okay? It's okay. Sorry, it was feeding back scratchy to me. So yeah, we have not launched astronauts from American soil since the last space shuttle flight in July of 2011. So it took 9 years to get a program ready, and it's part of the Commercial Crew Program. And SpaceX was the first one to reach the finish line on launching a crew into space. So this will be the first time that the United States has been able to launch from its own soil, which is a huge cost savings for the country as well. So unfortunately, the cost to launch through another program, in this case, we were always launching through Roscosmos, the Russian space program. They're the only ones who are able to launch crews into space at this point. Each seat on there cost $80 million per astronaut. So that was definitely pricey. But now we'll be able to send astronauts to the International Space Station again for a much lower cost.
Fantastic. Yeah, one of the things we're waiting on right now is the next poll, go no go for Mission Control, and that really is going to give us our best indication as to whether or not we're going to be launching today. As of right now, what we have systems wise would be a launch today. If not, there'd be a launch tomorrow, about 30 minutes earlier. And then if not, I think we're looking at Wednesday, June 3rd is going to be the next possibility. One of the big things out this morning were the forecasts from the 45th Space Weather Wing out at Patrick Air Force Base, just south of Kennedy Space Center, and they sort of make sure that the range for the space flights is weather capable. And as of right now, it was a 50-50 today, 60% chance of a good weather tomorrow, 70% for the middle of next week. So this is Florida. It's in the summer, so there's only so much we can do. Just kind of hoping that. And right now we are a go for propellant load.
45 minutes and counting. Reminder on hold and launch escape protocol. For non-urgent no-go conditions, brief the CE or LD, and they will approve aborting launch auto sequence and proceed to launch abort. For urgent issues affecting the safety of the operation, operators shall call hold on the countdown net. Launch control will immediately abort the launch auto sequence and proceed to the launch abort auto sequence. Operators shall also advise the launch director whether structural break or fire is imminent or occurring per Dragon manual escape flight rules. A reminder on fire alarm instructions. In the event of a fire alarm, key operators previously briefed will remain at their post while the alarm is evaluated. In the event that personal safety is threatened, evacuate to the south-facing emergency exit, which leads directly outside. At this time, weather is go for launch.
Excellent. So we are, hopefully as everything starts to pick up, we are go for launch at 3:22 p.m. And so we should be seeing the crew arm retract. We're gonna jump over to the standard NASA live stream for that. See what we're seeing there. You can see all the fun behind the scenes. But yeah, as we've retracted the crew arm, both Bob and Doug have been in the capsule now for a little bit more than an hour. I don't think we got a real good sense of what they had for breakfast this morning, but we'll kind of get that. We'll get that little information for you guys in a little bit. But Anna, of course, the big connection between this flight and the last crewed flight from American soil is Doug Hurley. And so can you give us a little bit of background about Doug and importantly, kind of his role in 135, and then of course what he's doing now here for Crew Dragon?
Sure. So Doug Hurley was on STS-135, which was the last launch. That was Space Shuttle Atlantis. And that launch had four astronauts on board. Typically the shuttle launched 7, but for the last launch, they just had 4. And their main mission with that was to, that's the one. The main mission was to bring supplies to the International Space Station. So once the launch was over, of course, that was the end of the shuttle program. NASA still existed. A lot of people wondered if NASA was gone or thought NASA was over, had been disbanded or whatever. But they were already working on what the next program was going to be, particularly because there have been some administration changes, and every time there's an administration change, there's typically a change to NASA's priorities and how different things work. That's just the nature of the beast, unfortunately. And so, and during that period of time afterwards, Hurley was selected to work with the Commercial Crew Program. So he and Bob Behnken, who's his crew member on this, were selected. Sunita Williams, one of my favorite astronauts as well, she was selected to do that as well. And so she was slated to go work with Boeing on the Starliner, and Hurley, who is on the right, and Behnken, who's on the left, they were selected to work with SpaceX. And so, yeah, so Hurley got to close out the end of the shuttle era, and he is getting to open up relaunching from American soil again, which is kind of cool. He said he didn't even think about that fact until the media brought it up to him. But another cool thing for me personally, and I mentioned this on Wednesday too, is that on that last shuttle flight, Sandra Magnus was on that flight, and Dr. Magnus is, she calls St. Louis, Missouri home, like me. And Bob Behnken also calls St. Louis, Missouri home. He's from St. Anne. So Hurley flew his last flight for the shuttle program with a St. Louisan, and he's flying this first flight again from American soil with a St. Louisan. So that's got to be good luck. But as we say in Missouri, have to wait and see. Show me.
Of course, you had to get it in there. So yeah, the very, very different systems, of course, that we're sending into space this time around. Of course, back in 2011, it was a shuttle orbiters that had been designed in the late 1960s into the 1970s. It was the solid rocket boosters and the large external fuel tank. Now, of course, we have sort of a capsule design that's very reminiscent of the sort of the heyday of NASA, very Gemini Apollo sort of inspired, and a standard rocket. Of course, what we're launching today is one of the Falcon 9 Block 5s. This is the most advanced, highest thrust version of the standard Falcon 9 rocket. Of course, there's the larger 3-boostered Falcon Heavy. And then, of course, in due time, we're looking towards some revisions. There's the Centaur Vulcan, the Vulcan Centaur, and of course, the big one, the SLS, that should be coming online. Knock on wood, fingers crossed, talk to anybody, and you probably get a different answer. Probably coming online, we would assume within the next 4 to 6 years. But in terms of that, yeah.
Its first test launch was supposed to be in 2017 because I specifically remember saying, I will be down there for that launch in 2017. And then it turned into, I will be down there for that launch in 2018. And now it's, I hope to be down there for that launch when it happens, and it's going to happen.
Yeah, and so you can see here, this is inside of the SpaceX horizontal integration facility. If you're wondering where that is, that's actually the building that's behind me in the background. Was built on the original trackways for the crawlers that moved first the Saturn V rockets and then later the shuttle orbiters from the vehicle assembly building to launch pads 39A and 39B. Today, of course, we are flying out of 39A. Which is, and Anna, you can correct me if I'm wrong, 39A was the launch pad for the Apollo 11 Saturn launch.
Yes.
And was the 39A was also the launch pad for STS-135. So there's a long history here in this part of the Space Coast, this part of Kennedy Space Center. But this integration facility built on that original trackway, so that as SpaceX works on their rockets, they can mate the Dragon capsule to the Falcon and then transport the rocket assembly out towards the launch pad. One of the things that's really striking in the photo on the left, Anna, is the fact that we have 4 boosters inside this building at once, 2 of them looking much, much worse for wear. And I guess one of the biggest things that we've seen from SpaceX in terms of how they've changed the way that we approach space travel has been the reusability of these rockets. And so turn over to you for a little bit, sort of how we've looked at reusability as a major part of crewed exploration since the shuttle missions, and why that's so important for us today.
Sure. So yeah, those first rockets that we used in the 60s and the early 70s, of course, were one-time use. So they either went all the way into space and were ejected there or jettisoned there rather, and then they burned up in the atmosphere, or parts of them splashed down in the ocean on the way, and then more of them burned up in the atmosphere, but they were never reusable. So there are tons of rocket parts littering the Atlantic Ocean from launches in the 60s and 70s. With the shuttle, parts of it were reusable. So of course the orbiter itself was reusable. And then the solid rocket boosters on the side were reusable as well. The orange part, the external tank, went into space and then it burned up in the atmosphere. But at least parts of it at this point were reusable. The idea was for that to be a cost savings. I've read that it was not necessarily the cost savings that they were hoping for it to be. But at least in terms of materials, you're reusing the same thing. You're not going out and using more resources. So that was a good start. And actually, just a quick little fun fact about that too, I believe it was the left solid rocket booster on STS-135, the top of it was part of the STS-1 launch 30 years prior. So yeah, so I mean, that goes to show the reusability of it. They didn't necessarily have all the exact same parts in the same solid rocket booster every time, but they were reused. So SpaceX has one-upped that now. So the solid rocket boosters from the shuttle landed in the ocean and then had to be found and picked up. SpaceX, however, in typical SpaceX fashion, nah, we're not going to go hunting for them. We're going to have them land on a landing pad in the middle of the ocean, so we know exactly where they are, and we'll just pick them up from there.
Yeah, there's a couple of those. Like this one, of course, is "Of Course I Still Love You," which we believe is going to be the landing ship that's located out in the Atlantic. And so one of the things that's kind of important with this mission, with every mission to the ISS, is that they have to launch at a specific angle off the Space Coast to be able to get into the same orbital inclination of the ISS. It's currently right about like 52 degrees. And so, of course, I Still Love You, it's probably off the Virginia coast at this point, the Carolinas and Virginia, not closer to the Floridian coast, kind of given how the mission apparatus, the mission parameters are going to look. So just a little bit there. So Anna, please continue.
Oh no, that was great. So the boosters that the SpaceX program uses, they're reusable. So they pick those up and they work with them. So those ones that we saw in that image before that looked pretty worse for wear, that's because they were used, and they're going to be refurbished so that they can be hopefully used again. Great. So of course, we probably have all seen the footage of the spectacular failures as well, of the trying to land those boosters on, for example, I Still Love You. Those ones, I'm not sure how much of those were recovered. But in general, it's been very, very successful. Colin, that is an excellent question. Colin asked, do we know the turnaround time of the boosters? And that, unfortunately, I do not know off the top of my head.
And of course, because we have the internet and we want to be able to get that, as at least right now, according to the Washington Post, it's about 2 months.
Okay.
So about a 60-day turnaround time. And what we've got up here, of course, is the Dragon capsule itself. Of course, very, very reminiscent of the capsules of yore. This is probably a bit more of an Apollo era capsule look. Certainly not the tiny phone booths of the Mercury program, or the aesthetically beautiful, but I can't imagine very large Gemini capsules.
I mean, I find them quite roomy, but so they were often called the Gusmobile. So I'm just going to get this out of the way. If you don't know me very well, Gemini is absolutely my favorite program. So I just love it. So anyway, Gus Grissom was the head engineer that worked on that with the McDonnell Aircraft employees. And so everything he kind of just fit to himself. And he was notoriously the smallest of the Mercury 7 astronauts. And so I'm 5'4". He, depending on what you read, he was 5'6" or 5'7". So either way, that capsule was built to be comfortable for him. And even he felt a little cramped in there. But yeah, the other astronauts were not super happy with where things were laid out within the Gemini spacecraft. But like I said, for me, I had plenty of room. I don't know what they were complaining about. Seemed plenty roomy to me.
Yeah, I can't imagine what it would be like to be a larger 6'1" man in one of those capsules. And of course,
well, you wouldn't be. That would be over the height restriction.
Precisely. And especially with Gemini, some of those missions were not of inconsequential length. No. These were in some cases almost shuttle level mission lengths.
They were longer than, because they wanted to make sure that if calculations were off or whatever, and they had to spend a lot of time in space for Apollo to get to the moon and back, they wanted to have the worst case scenario under their belts, which was 2 weeks. So Gemini 7 stayed in space for almost 14 days, just under 14 days, which they were very happy to see land after that. And still remained very good friends, flew another mission together. Lovell and Borman flew again on Apollo 8. So, could have ended very poorly, but especially after sharing a toothbrush for 2 weeks. So, because Borman lost his, and Lovell was like, "We're already sharing oxygen and everything else. Just use my toothbrush too."
Hey, I mean, there you go. So, just a quick update: we're about 30 minutes out from the launch. It looks like range weather has gotten better. We're probably closer to 70% go right now. So, as long as there are no real issues between now and 3:22 Eastern, we are very likely to see one of the more historic launches in American space history. The Dragon capsule kind of go into there. There's there's limitations, of course, to how big these capsules can be. There's payload limitations for the rockets. You're not going to have a capsule that's substantially larger in diameter, for example, than the rocket itself. But one of the very important aspects about the Dragon, just how much room is inside of these things. Of course, we have 2 astronauts on the mission today. I think there's 4 seats installed. Anna, do you know how many crew we can put, or kind of the maximum crew that would have been in sort of the commercial crew in Orion level?
I'm pretty sure it's 7 in all of the craft. So it's the same as the shuttle. Maybe not quite as roomy as the shuttle. I mean, that was a much larger craft. However, as far as the capsules go, oh yeah, I mean, that's like the Hilton of capsule style spacecraft, if you can fit 7 people in there. And it still looks like they have room to move and everything as well. When we were watching on Wednesday, I mean, the ground crew, the clean room crew, the white room crew, they were getting in the capsule with them. So, I mean, that gives you an idea too, of just how much there's space there is in there compared to even Apollo, which was the first time astronauts could actually get out of their seats and float around inside the capsule. So, I mean, you're getting all the ground crew in there too with them. It's just a giant party in there.
Yeah, and then of course we're of course seeing in very stark, in a very stark way, the difference in the technologies. Of course, is that the technologies that we're trying to put in these capsules in the 60s and the early 70s are analog. There's a lot of wiring and in some cases hydraulics. A lot of things that could go wrong, but a lot of things that just take up a lot of space. And if you've seen inside the capsule as of now, it's touch screens, and it's the difference between sort of flying an aircraft in the 40s and flying one of the fighter aircraft today, where it's touch screens and you can move things around, and it's essentially
heads up views. And
yeah,
like,
let's just take a Tesla and make it into a space capsule, which of course I guess
they kind of already did that.
Yeah. Well, yes, quite literally did that.
Yeah.
But you can very much see the Elon Musk aesthetic in all of this, and that's probably a good segue to talk about the man himself, Elon Musk. And one of the things that's probably the biggest differentiator between NASA working with SpaceX today versus NASA working with defense contractors back in the 50s and 60s and 70s. I think it was Rockwell or North American Aviation that helped to design the shuttle, and on and on throughout NASA's history, the ability to work with either defense or contractors alike, is that a lot of what we see with SpaceX is really the brainchild of Elon Musk and sort of his force of personality wanting to do all this. Kind of looking at this holistically across like the context of the history of crewed flight. What's your opinion on Elon Musk? Is having this sort of once in a generation type figure a good thing for space travel, or is it kind of a bad thing to have the majority of NASA's ability to send people into space on the shoulders of a guy who on a whim could say, no, I'm done with this. I'm going to go move to a mountain somewhere and never see anybody again.
Well, he is selling off all of his property, I heard. I think, at least from what I've seen of him, this is too much of a work of love for him. I will also say too that he was incredibly smart in who he employed. He has an excellent team of engineers that created this vision. I mean, I'm not trying to downplay anything that Elon did, but certainly I also want to give credit where it's due. And without those engineers, at SpaceX, this would not be happening right now. Not by a long shot. I mean, when you build rockets, it's always a team effort. No question. But I think, I mean, going back and looking at aircraft and aviation and commercial aviation, I mean, you wouldn't have had, or at least it wouldn't have gone as quickly as it did if it weren't for Howard Hughes. So
great point.
I don't know. I mean, if someone's quote unquote eccentric or quirky or odd or whatever adjective that you want to use that may sound negative, I don't know that that's always a bad thing, because oftentimes they're the creative ones who find a solution, and maybe they're the ones that get the ball rolling, and then other people are able to take it over and make it happen and make it better and continue to happen.
Well, then that probably we'll get your opinion on this one, and of course I can give mine. This, of course, is not a SpaceX live stream, so we can say things and Elon can't shut us down. Elon Musk, slightly misunderstood super genius or slightly misunderstood supervillain in training?
Why not both?
Brilliant. That's the way to go. And of course, a little bit later, as we get closer to the launch, a little bit more on sort of NASA's favorite logo, the meatball or the worm, and it's important to note from 1975 until I think it was 1992, the official NASA logo was known as the worm. It was the very kind of prototypical 1970s design, was still one of the more famous probably works of branding in the history of the world, but of course on the side of the VAB, and of course throughout most of NASA's existence, we've had the meatball, sort of the badge, and there are a number of people, my co-host included, who vehemently believe that the meatball is the superior logo. And so
because it is.
As a gentleman and a co-host, I'll give you the floor first to explain why the meatball is the superior NASA logo.
There's a lot of meaning behind the logo. I mean, first of all, it harkens back to the very beginning. It's the history of NASA. I will say I did grow up with the worm logo, so it's not like I hate it and I want it to go away forever. It's just that I find the meatball superior. And even during the time of the worm, that was the one you saw predominantly, but the meatball was always the official public logo of NASA. But I mean, you have all the symbolism that lies within the logo, and the worm, while very clean, has no symbolism to it. It's just a stylistic thing. Meanwhile, you have this vector shooting off in the space that's based on the constellation of Andromeda and the meatball, and you have the orbits shown, and you have all of these the number of stars even represent certain things that for being the space expert on here, I should remember off the top of my head and don't. So I apologize for that. But I mean, there's always just this beautiful in-depth meaning behind this logo that even if you don't know it, you can appreciate. And like I said, with the worm, it's just stylistic. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing wrong with having something artistic or stylistic, but I find the meatball much more artistic.
And you can see here just the live stream working with us perfectly. You can see the meatball there on the very top part of the Falcon staging. But when the Falcon, the rocket itself was rolled out, it was quite a controversy to see the NASA worm logo on a rocket going to space. Something that just had not been a decision since when we were kids.
Yeah.
when we were tiny space nerds and not the ones that we are now. And there, of course, is probably the most iconic NASA meatball in the world on the side of the vehicle assembly building. For a sense of scale, that meatball is 130 by 110 feet. Just an enormous work of art on the side of the VAB. Went back and checked, Anna, the very first Redstone clocked in at under 100 feet in height. So that meatball, taller than the rocket that Alan Shepard rode, granted into suborbital space, but still into American history back in 1961. So just the sense of scale on how big these things are. And so as we look now, we're do some math here in my head, just about 18, 19 minutes to go. We are currently venting, which is, of course, in Florida, a great sign. High humidity means condensation, so that's not an issue. This is us moving ever closer to one of the more historic launches here in American history. And so with Benkin and Hurley both on board, the plan is, of course, is they're going to make their way up to the International Space Station. They're going to dock in about 2 days' time with the forward-facing Harmony capsule, and that's going to allow them to unload both of them, the two astronauts, as well as quite a bit of cargo that's included in what's known as the trunk of the Dragon capsule. And so the seating is up at the top. The trunk below is unpressurized, has a series of solar panels to provide some additional power to the capsule itself. And they'll be up at the space station for quite a while. Both Benkin and Hurley are shuttle astronauts. I believe it was Benkin. One of their missions was among the longest of the shuttle missions. I think it was 17 days. And we'll go back and figure out exactly which one, because it's going to bother both of us for the rest of the webcast. But then, like Anna said, she's may or may not know this space fact, and here we are talking about everything that we've done in space since 1961, and hopefully we'll get most of it right. But this is now that we're less than T20 minutes, we're going to be loading the liquid oxygen onto the spacecraft. One of the big differences with the Falcon 9 versus what we've seen in rockets before is that propellant is loaded with people on board. And that is still well within the safety guidelines that NASA put out for the commercial crew capsules. And so given the fact that we're here working with the Falcon rockets, which maybe not as consistently perfect. Tori Bruno, who heads up ULA, I think every time that there's a successful Delta launch, he'll say just, it's the next, this had something like 240 or 250 straight launches without a failure. The Falcon 9s are getting up there as well. And so we have, of course, what you're seeing now. If you're at all in tune with SpaceX, you may have seen an anomaly that occurred in South Texas yesterday for Starship 4, during one of the static fires. Of course, an entirely different program, and what we're looking here much more mature than Starship, which is a bleeding edge project that Elon and SpaceX have going. But Anna, one of the things that's important for us to talk about now that we're about 15 minutes from launch, we talked about it a little bit on Wednesday, and it's always important for us to have this at the forefront. This is dangerous, and we're hoping for a flawless launch, and almost certainly you're going to get that. But space is dangerous, and getting to space is dangerous, and we know that they've gone through a lot of the precautions. One of the big issues we had in the early 80s was go fever. And if you want to talk a little bit about sort of why we are in the sort of the position that we are now in terms of what we do getting up to a launch versus, maybe the way things were in the past, and sort of the shortcuts that might have been taken, and in some cases for the worst.
So Go Fever actually goes back to the Apollo 1 tragedy. They were so desperate to beat the Soviets to the moon, and to even more so to meet Kennedy's deadline of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely before the end of the decade. And so they were doing whatever they could to rush, and corners were being cut. And they went to do the plugs out test January 27th, 1967 for Apollo 1. And I mean, it was just problems galore. They couldn't even talk to each other between buildings. And Gus Grissom says on the transcript, you hear him say, how are we supposed to talk to each other from space when we can't even talk between 3 buildings? And during those plugs out tests, which were like dress rehearsals for the launch, they always pumped the cabin full of 100% oxygen. And until that point, have never had a problem. That's what they did all through Mercury and Gemini. Never had a problem. But unfortunately, due to the shortcuts that happened, there was some faulty wiring under Grissom's couch, and there was some contact, there was some sparks, and that spark initiated immediately a flash fire in the capsule. And within about 6 seconds, all 3 astronaut lives were lost. Or at least, fortunately, they were unconscious. So that really rocked NASA hard. They had lost astronauts, but never before in preparation for the mission. It was always, unfortunately, due to a T-38 crash. Mm-hmm. And so they stopped the program. There were no more launches until 1968 with Apollo 7. I already talked about Gemini 7. And so during that time, they did a huge investigation, and they were finding things like not only was the wiring bad, and, we did this 100% oxygen, and the capsule was full of highly flammable things. And, they found tools that were inside the walls of the spacecraft that somebody had dropped and just forgotten about. Yeah, they completely took apart the spacecraft and found all these things that had just been overlooked and they were rushing. They were working 3-4 shifts, and people were moving from shift to shift. And they weren't signing off correctly on things. Mm-hmm. And so after that, they really upped what needed to be done. And every time there was an incident, NASA took it as a learning experience, of course, which is what you should do, particularly when something fatal happens. And so, like, for example, with Apollo 13, that thankfully was not fatal, but despite having multiple redundancies, they added another one for safety. And so just in case an oxygen tank were to blow again, for example, there was one more located on the opposite side of the spacecraft after that. So now when you get to the shuttle program, 1986, we get the Challenger on January 28th. So a day after the anniversary of the Apollo 1 astronauts. And this Challenger flight had been delayed several times. And this was the one that, of course, the Teacher in Space program was set to fly on. They didn't want to push back anymore. They didn't want to deal with the media. They didn't want to deal with any of that. And so despite the fact that they had been warned by Morton Thiokol, they were, they still wanted to launch. And so despite the parameters not being the best, they decided to go. And unfortunately, we lost all 7 astronauts. So that was another time to have to turn around and look at what was going on and look at, what did we do wrong? This was our fault. How do we fix this? And even when it came to Columbia, that was a little bit different in terms of it wasn't launch, and they didn't necessarily know that something had hit the shuttle and damaged that leading left wing, but they did know it was a possibility with the ice flaking off. And so I will say too, something that makes me very happy with all of this return to flight here from United States soil is that I really appreciate that we are going back to the capsule design versus the orbiter design, because the capsule has to launch from on top of the rocket. There's no launching from the side of the launch vehicle. The shuttle was originally supposed to launch from on top of the STS stack. However, it was much smaller, and the powers that be outside of NASA decided it needed to be larger. And so because of that, it had to be mounted on the side. And you can argue that both of the shuttle incidents would not have occurred had it been mounted on top and not on the side of the launch stack. So this launching into space on top of a very, very combustible situation, never going to be safe. Never going to be 100% safe.
That reminds me of I think it was an interview with like the NPR station in Orlando I gave a couple of years ago, and it was just that. It was like, you know why space is scary? Because you're putting people on the top of a metal tube that has fire coming out of the bottom of it, and you expect everything to be okay at the end of the day, when it's like you could be backing out of your driveway and hit the mailbox, and it's like, well, I've been driving every day for 40 years. We're sending people into space on top of a rocket. It just boggles the mind how mundane this became after a while, and sort of where, like, we're all super excited, but the last thing on anybody's mind is, oh, everything's gonna go wrong. It's like, we trust that they know what they're doing.
Yeah. I'm always amused too when it's called a candle, like in Alan Shepard's flight. Yeah, let's light this candle. That makes it sound fun, like something on top of a birthday cake that you blow out, like not something that could potentially explode and kill you. Which, I mean, pilots are always, avoiding those kinds of terms that insinuate that, they don't talk about airplane crashes. Oh, he augured in. He didn't crash, he augured in. So, but still, I still find candle one of the funnier analogies in my mind, at least.
Well, and it really does. It becomes very, very clear why the vast majority of the first astronauts, and we're not even talking like the initial Mercury 7, but like the first 2 or 3 classes of astronauts were predominantly test pilots. Men who clearly had some ice water running through their veins, and like the ability to think that Neil Armstrong, for example, was one of the test pilots in the X-15 program, fastest winged aircraft in history. He's going like Mach 7 over the desert somewhere, and then being in the astronaut corps, NASA looks at him and goes, that's the guy we'd like to command the first landing on the moon. Yeah, he's going to be fine. Something's going to go wrong, and that those instincts are going to immediately kick in.
Well, and they train so much that it is instinct. They don't have to think about it. And that's exactly what you want to have. I mean, it's, in my mind, at least, it's somewhat like driving a car, in the sense that, like, how many of us have, driven home from work, listened to the radio or an audiobook or something, and then we're home and we're like, oh, when did I get here? Because everything's just on automatic pilot. And that's exactly what you want from an astronaut going into space, particularly if there's an anomaly, that they're going to be able to keep a level head and null out the situation, like Neil Armstrong did on Gemini 8 when his spacecraft, they could have blacked out, and he was able to keep a cool enough head, pull them out of the roll, and return them to Earth safely. Neil Armstrong did that a lot. He also almost died in training for the lunar landing when he was flying the they called it the flying bedpost, but it was the trainer, and it was very unstable, and he was unable to keep it in the position it needed to be in, and he had to bail out, and it exploded in a fiery crash. And 2 hours later, he was sitting in his office doing paperwork, and everybody was kind of like, you could go home if you wanted. You've kind of had a day. No, I'm good.
Go for it. So we are just about T-minus 5 minutes on to lift off here. uh, it's launch or liftoff, but liftoff just feels right for it. Like you can launch anything, but you really have to lift off a rocket. We are at the point where we have moved towards engine chill. There are the array of engines at the bottom of the Falcon 9 rocket. 5 minutes to T-minus. That's incredible. And so everything here, weather, propellant load, all of the chill, everything looks to be green across the board. At about 1 minute, we're going to introduce the live stream audio, and probably have people who are much better prepared to launch this into space, do the talking, while we get to sit back and enjoy it. But this really is history, and one of the great parts about space exploration, whether it's from here in the United States or elsewhere in the world, this really is the highest peak of sort of technology, and what we've been able to do as a species is launch people off the rock and send them somewhere else. And so this is the door opening to now a new future for American spaceflight.
And I do want to throw out there really quick too, because we always talk about the astronauts, and with the case of SpaceX, we're talking about, Elon Musk and this company. But Joanne, I'm so envious that you're going to go outside and watch from actually there. But I do want to point out too that it's not just those couple of entities. I mean, you have everybody in mission control who is around the clock keeping these people alive, watching their systems, working problems. You have, the dietitians who are planning what the astronauts are going to eat to keep them healthy. You have physical therapists working on how they're going to prevent muscle loss. You have everything and anything under the sun. You have when you're dealing with the International Space Station, every single astronaut must speak both English and Russian. And then you have other languages up there too, often Japanese or German or Italian or whatever else. And so you have people who are translating things sometimes. The astronauts aren't going to translate everything that's coming down through transmissions for everybody on the ground. So, and this goes too, if there's any kids watching, anything that you might want to be, you could probably do it for NASA or a space agency. Literally everything from refrigerator repair to veterinarians, everything.
This is quite amazing. We are on internal power. Dragon Capsule's on internal power, looking about 3.5 minutes, maybe a little bit less at this point. This is exciting. This really is sort of something that I think for you and I, Anna, kind of growing up, we were born in the middle of the 80s. We became space junkies at the height of the shuttle program. I grew up in Central Florida, and I can probably count 60 launches that I saw. And it wasn't like I had to go to the Space Coast. It's you go to the end of your parents' driveway, you look up and it launches, and you go back inside. It's no big deal. But to be at this point where we're getting to do this and sharing it with everyone makes it.
It's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I don't think either of us really had a choice to not become space nerds. I grew up outside of NASA Ames in Northern California, and used to play inside of an old stage Titan 1 rocket that was outside. So when that's your playground, starting when you're 2-3 years old, I mean,
the first house my parents lived in Florida was off of John Young Parkway, and the elementary school was John Young Elementary, and the planetarium in Orlando was John Young Planetarium. And you're just surrounded by it. It's in the 2 minutes or so we have, I'm a graduate of the University of Central Florida, go Knights, where literally every road on campus is named for either a rocket or a constellation. And how many of those are let's light this candle. So what we're going to do is turn on the audio for this and kind of sit back and watch the live stream and see if we can't get Demo-2 into orbit.
Yes.
Dragon is in auto idle.
ground gas closeouts is starting.
Go NASA, go SpaceX.
We wanted to jump ahead, so here we go.
Vehicle pitching downrange.
1 Alpha.
Copy, 1 Alpha.
Stage 1 propulsion is nominal.
Falcon power and telemetry nominal.
M1D throttle down.
Vehicle is supersonic.
M1D throttle up.
Max Q.
And then for those of you at
1
home,
Bravo.
max Q is
Copy,
the
1
point
Bravo.
in our launch where we have maximum aerodynamic pressure on the rocket that combines atmospheric pressure and the acceleration forward. Once you get through max Q, things tend to get a little bit safer, but that's a very important milestone in the launch.
Start of MVAC engine chill.
It's also the name of a great astronaut band.
Of course, you'll notice if you remember the shuttle missions, the solid rocket boosters produced a very distinctive contrail that, because of the different design of the Falcon, we don't see that same level of contrail. And so liquid versus the solid rocket.
M1D throttle down. Eco.
2 Alpha.
Falcon stage separation confirmed.
Copy, 2 Alpha.
All right, we're going to jump over to the SpaceX.
MVAC
Livestream.
ignition nominal.
Which will cut off at SECO, or second engine cut off at about 8 minutes and 44 seconds into today's flight. So a little over 5 minutes to go still on this second stage. You heard the call out 2 Alpha, so they're now in the longest abort zone that carries them all the way from about North Carolina up the eastern seaboard almost to Canada. Things looking good, though, getting good call outs, nominal propulsion on that second stage. Bob and Doug continuing to make their way into orbit.
Dragon SpaceX nominal trajectory.
Acquisition of signal in Bermuda.
SpaceX Dragon nominal trajectory.
Man, look at how much room they have in there compared to the Soyuz.
Continuing to make their flight uphill. Heard acquisition of signal Bermuda. That's one of the other ground stations that they're using to get telemetry and data back from this spacecraft.
Stage 2 propulsion is still nominal.
You could definitely see them being able to cross their legs on a 1G acceleration. You know, just the most stylish way of going into space.
Yes, Toshi, nominal is indeed a very beautiful word.
A little over 4 minutes, 40 seconds into the flight.
Oh, that's a good question.
With 5,600 miles
Dragon
per hour.
SpaceX nominal trajectory.
Amy's son,
Miles downrange.
if the crew stays strapped into their seat the entire 19 hours, or if they can move about the tiny cabin. In Soyuz, they don't have a choice. They stay where they are. And if you've seen the Soyuz, whew, I can't imagine staying in there in the same spot for that long. It looks cramped. Here, however, I would imagine that they can get out and fly and float around. I have not read anything saying one way or the other. Same thing goes for using the restroom. Apparently, the using of the restroom facilities in the SpaceX spacecraft have been a little bit of a mystery. I've seen a couple articles now talk about that, and they haven't been able to get answers on what that is. I would imagine it's probably something fairly similar to what was available in Apollo, and probably similar somewhat to what is available in the ISS.
And if you're looking at that speed, they're moving at, right now close to 12,000 miles per hour. That's, New York City to Miami in about 4.5 minutes. It's incredible how fast they're moving.
Again, on your right screen is that first stage booster coming back towards our drone ship. Of course, I still love you. We're about a minute away from entry burn.
Yeah, and what you're looking at there on the right side, those are titanium blades, essentially, that allow the first stage of Falcon to maintain as much aerodynamic consistency on the body of it as possible. It really allows it to steer itself through reentry and then towards the drone ship. Usually what we'll see on satellite missions is a return to landing zones 1 and 2, which are going to be on the Space Coast. But because of the mission here to the ISS, and specifically because of the launch inclination to the north, we're going to have the drone ship be our final.
Entry burn on your right screen. We should be able to see that view live.
Stage 1 entry burn startup.
It's amazing too how quickly you're able to see the curvature of the Earth.
It's shocking that it's not flat.
Who would have thought?
Just somehow all of these equations, all of these calculations work.
And, also like images and stuff actually taken from space.
That entry burn continues. We're just about a minute away from SECO. We'll have a number of events all happen in rapid succession. It'll be the second engine cutoff.
Stage 1
we'll be looking
burn
for that stage 1 landing burn shortly after.
Actually, just within a few seconds of each other. It's such a cool.
Yeah, more than anything, even the reusability side of it, since the shuttles themselves were reusable, it is the fact that SpaceX and let's be clear here, the engineers at SpaceX and with NASA have it so that you have an uncrewed, essentially dummy bottom stage that can make its way back to a pinpoint landing. Some of the landings they've had within a foot of intended spot, which is incredible. You're sending something into orbit and you can get something back on Earth to a foot without any sort of onboard control is incredible.
Oh, that's interesting. Thanks for pointing that out, Steve. So the route across the Atlantic right now is similar to that of Charles Lindbergh's.
Confirmation of SECO's second engine cutoff.
Now we are waiting for our first stage to make its way to our drone ship. Of course, I still love you.
Dragon SpaceX nominal orbital insertion.
Confirmation nominal orbital insertion.
Excellent. Nominal orbital insertion means that the capsule itself is on the correct trajectory to intercept the International Space Station.
Coming down.
Oh no.
And if SpaceX loses their signal, it means that we don't have to feel bad about losing ours every once in a while. And it landed.
There you can see on your screen.
Man,
so that happened.
Just beautiful.
Landed. This is the first Falcon 9 to carry humans to orbit, so very exciting for us. And as you can see on your right screen, Bob,
so I'm going to be Indiana Jones here for a minute. I know we're supposed to reuse those and stuff, but that belongs in a museum.
So exciting today.
Without a doubt.
I mean,
it does
nobody in America wants that. We'd be happy to take it here in Berlin, I'm sure.
insertion. So that means Falcon 9 and Dragon right now.
In case you're watching, Elon.
B.
If Elon Musk is somehow watching this exact live stream,
I will lose my mind. Oh, sparkly dinosaur. I love the little things that they bring into orbit with them to show that they've achieved the microgravity. And it's almost always something personal and specific to the crew members and or their family.
From the second
or even in the example of the German astronaut Alexander Gerst, when he went up, he brought the mouse. There's a TV show here. It's the mouse of the TV show, and and so he brought that up to have floating around with him for all the kids in Germany to have something to be excited about. And I've seen snowmen and all kinds of other things. So I would not be surprised if that sparkly dinosaur came from one of their children.
Oh, and of course, the as sparkly as the Dragon is, the Dragon Capsule, the story goes, is named for Puff the Magic Dragon, one of the better children's / drug songs of the past 50 years. So,
a little over 124 miles.
Peter, Paul, and Mary, probably my favorite version. So, call it to the parents. So
well,
now,
are there other versions? Does it matter if there's other versions?
Not at all. If it's not Peter, Paul, and Mary, then why even listen to it? And so what we're seeing, of course, is that the astronauts themselves, you see the speed, 27,000 kilometers per hour. This is what we would consider, this is free fall velocity. They are in orbit around the Earth. They're in constant state of free fall. That's what allows that feeling of microgravity to exist. Of course, there is still gravity in space. They are in orbit around the Earth, and they're not going anywhere in particular. But beautiful.
Oh, man.
There is a great view right in front of you.
And that is
separating. And there's call out.
Beautiful.
Now officially making its way to the International
Majestic
Space Station
doesn't seem
today.
like majestic is not a majestic enough word for it.
I think awesome in the most literal and true sense of that word would be a correct description. That is truly an awesome sight.
Dragon, Chief Engineer on Dragon to Ground. Bob Doug, on behalf of the entire launch team, thanks for flying with Falcon 9 today. We hope you enjoyed the ride and wish you a great mission.
Thanks, Paula. Congratulations to you and the F9 team for the first human ride for Falcon 9, and it was incredible. Appreciate all the hard work, and thanks for the great ride to space.
Copy all.
Paula and Mike, proud of you guys and the rest of the team. Thank you so much for what you've done for us today, putting America back into low Earth orbit from the Florida coast.
Copy all. Good luck. Godspeed.
Yeah, so I say this as, a 25-year resident of Florida. It's nice when Florida does something right.
So Bob and Doug are in.
It really is. So now we have 2 humans on their way to the ISS, launched from American soil for the first time since 2011. And it was nothing but a smooth ride all the way up. And, it was such an honor to be able to share that with you and with everybody here in our Zoom room, on Facebook, on YouTube, around the world. Thank you, guys, for helping make this as special as it is.
Definitely. This was definitely a launch to be remembered, and I'm super grateful and honored that we all got to share this together. I also love too that I believe that's Hurley in the left seat, or is that Bankin? I thought Hurley was on the right.
Hurley should be on the left.
Or on the left, yeah. So I love that he just has his legs crossed, like his ankles are crossed. Yep, just floating around.
Right, exactly. And
I mean, why not?
Done for today, but the mission.
You're on your way to the ISS
Crew Dragon's job
in a really
is
cool
not done,
capsule.
as you can see.
And you can stretch out.
Making their way, it will be a 19-hour trip to the International Space Station.
19 hours to the space station.
Dock tomorrow morning.
Great. Well, that I think
Such
kind
cool
of
views.
brings
I love
our
that we can get these
brings
live
our
views
need
here
to be
and
talking
see
over
and watch
this
what
to
they're
an
doing
end.
now that they are in orbit.
I don't know what we're going to do this again, Anna. I think maybe we should do this for Perseverance. Let's talk Mars next time. I think that'll be a lot of fun.
I like Mars.
Yeah. It's it's not as it's not crude missions from the US, but it's still pretty cool.
Well, and with how much we personify the rovers on Mars, it may as well be.
Exactly. We're gonna come to love Perseverance the same way we did Opportunity and Spirit and Curiosity.
I'll be.
Well, it lived a good life. It lived a good life.
Yes, it did.
So next time when we watch the Perseverance launch and Anna brings out the little Opportunity rover, we'll have a great time of it all. But
I actually don't have one. I do have Curiosity. I have a very little Curiosity that I got Adam Steltzner to sign for me, which was like a fantastic moment in my life. I'm not gonna even try to pretend it wasn't.
No, that's amazing. So thank you all for joining us. On behalf of Anna Green, so fantastic. I'm Mike McConville. This is a historic day, and we're glad that we got to share it all with you. So until next time, take care and keep looking up.
And we're going to send
have a stellar day, everyone.
To continue broadcasting